Good evening, guys and dolls. You ready to go down the mean streets and meet some hard characters, bust some heads, and maybe help someone out along the way? Well, you better be, because tonight we are talking about pulp fiction, specifically the pulp fiction of Raymond Chandler, who, in my professional opinion, is the greatest of all the hard-boiled detective fiction authors. Hope you are doing well this evening. Let's go ahead and jump in. You may have noticed my background is different tonight. It is very dark, and it is very actually noir lighting. If you are familiar with black and white detective movies from the 40s and 50s, you will recognize darkness and single source of bright, harsh light as part of the general way film noir movies were filmed. And the plots of these movies, which were like The Big Sleep, The Maltese Falcon, Casablanca, were often taken from pulp fiction, which was magazines that printed on very pulpy paper, hence the title, very popular mass audience driven fiction that was usually based on suspense. They were thrillers, they were exciting, action packed stories. Most of them about private detectives going out into the dark, cold world of the criminal underbelly to try to make something positive happen in the world. And Raymond Chandler, though he was not the first to write in this genre, brought that genre to a new level through his masterful use of language in both descriptions and his ways of using slang, which, as you have read the story already, you know how highly he uses the slang into such a great effect. And because of his plots that had deeper themes than any of his contemporaries had in their pulp fictions, themes that explored the nature of morality, of ethics, of what the right thing to do is, and what is the ultimate fate of good people in a corrupt world. Before we get into all that, though, let's talk a little bit about who exactly Raymond Chandler was. First thing to know about him is that his father was American and his mother was English. And his father walked out on his family at a very, very, very early point. So Raymond Chandler never actually knew his father. His mother moved back to England, where she and her mother raised Raymond alone with no man through his entire life. And so he lived a huge portion of his life from infancy to young adulthood in London, England. And that is also where he first started to try to write poetry. And you can tell from those early poets that he is a Brit through and through. He has internalized British culture, and his imagination is just instinctively moving towards medieval themes. He loves knights. He loves King Arthur stories. He loves chivalry. He loves all the stuff that the medieval stories were about. This is rather shocking to some people to see that this is the guy who will eventually become the Philip Marlowe Pulp Fiction guy. But it's not actually that much of a surprise, as we will talk about later on. He was in the Canadian Air Force, actually, during World War I, and then following that, he moved to California, where he was doing something totally different from writing. He had failed at being a poet, so he was not interested in writing anymore. He was an executive at an oil company, where he eventually lost his job, probably due to excessive drinking on the job. Why was Chandler drinking so much? Well, probably because of how corrupt he found out that oil company was and all of the shady things it was doing in its business. Raymond Chandler always was a man of very high morality. And he was, again, British. He was very proper. And he was, frankly, disgusted by the just complete disregard for ethics that he saw in that company and also in American culture at large. Once he lost his job, it was the Great Depression as well, so things were super bad. And so he decided to turn again to writing because he was a big fan of pulp fiction. He read a lot of these detective stories and he liked the genre, and he thought that he could actually do better than some of these other authors out there. And he did. And the rest is pretty much history. That's how he got started. Now, this genre of pulp fiction, you should know, was once again kind of like we talked about with the Gift of the Magi being a precursor to Hallmark movies. In a world before television, people were entertained either through radio or through reading. And a really popular reading material for the masses were these pulp fiction magazines that sold short fiction that was exciting and action-packed and full of thrills. That's what people were interested in, very much kind of like before blockbusters were a thing, before movies were a thing, that kind of stuff you found in these pulp fiction magazines. Crime and detective fiction was the most popular genres of pulp fiction, though there were others. And in these stories, you usually had a hardened detective, private detective, working in the criminal underbelly of some big city like LA, for instance, trying to go out into the world and bring justice to the dregs of society. Trouble is My Business is one of Raymond Chandler's many stories featuring the detective Philip Marlowe. Marlowe is a very interesting character on a number of levels. One of the things that makes him so interesting is that even though he is a detective, a private detective, and he knows all the tricks of the trade, and he is very comfortable in his world of corrupt pulp fiction LA, in terms of his personality, his ethics, how he views the world, he is a medieval knight. He is chivalrous. He is respectful, especially to women. He is loyal to employers who prove themselves to be loyal and worthy of his respect. And he is always more concerned with achieving justice than he is with his own personal gain. Chandler instilled very consciously the ethics of medieval knights onto this detective character, which is not surprising given his background in England and his early subject interests. Also, fun fact, his very first detective character was named Mallory, which is the name of Sir Thomas Malory, the author of Le Morte d'Arthur, which is one of the seminal medieval texts telling the whole Arthur story. So you can see how that character developed into Philip Marlowe, and Marlowe is still an extension of that knightly character. And you see Marlowe display all of those traits inside of this story. Throughout this entire story, Marlowe is battling with his conscience because he is a knight who is in a world that is very different from the Middle Ages. It is very harsh. It is unfeeling. It is unchivalrous. And so how does a knight like Marlowe exist in a world that is so different from the Middle Ages? Well, one of the quotes that Chandler wrote in an essay called The Simple Art of Murder, where he talked about his philosophy to writing, gives us an extremely important bit of information for understanding who Philip Marlowe is as a character. I will read this quote at length. But down these mean streets a man must go, who is not himself mean, who is neither tarnished nor afraid. The detective in this kind of story must be such a man. He is the hero. He is everything. He must be a complete man and a common man, and yet an unusual man. He must be, to use a rather weathered phrase, a man of honor, by instinct, by inevitability, without thought of it, and certainly without saying it. He must be the best man in his world and a good enough man for any world. So we see here that Marlowe is Chandler's ideal detective, and as he said, an ideal detective is a man of honor, a man who is not tarnished by the world around him and also not afraid of that evil world around him. He's aware of the corruption, he's not corrupted by it, and he is also not afraid to face it head on. And thus we see as Philip Marlowe once again dives into another case in this story. What's different about this story, though, is that he does not want to take this case. From the beginning, he mentions that he wanted to get up and leave as the detective agency was telling him about the case. But he's hungry, right? But he needs the money. And so that need is driving him to do this. And we think maybe he is in danger of compromising himself. If he's willing to sell out for money, then he is definitely no longer a chivalrous knight. However, as you keep going, you see that he is doing this job, but he is not going to do it according to how his employer wants him to do it. He immediately dislikes his employer, right? He doesn't like Jeters from the moment he sees him. And Marlowe is a very good judge of character, specifically men that he meets. He almost always very quickly knows what kind of people they are, whether they are good, whether they are evil, whether they are to be trusted or not. And he knows from the beginning that he does not like Jeters, that something is up, something is not good about him. We know from a front that he's a greedy rich man, which is a common archetype in these stories, the greedy rich man. Chandler probably met several of them while he was working in that oil company. And they are almost always portrayed as either negative characters or outright evil characters. And they represent the greed that Chandler saw corrupting American society. And so Jeters has this case that he gives him, but Jeters wants it done in a specific way, right? He wants Miss Huntress completely out of his stepson's life and have nothing to do with her. She gets left out in the cold. What Marlowe wants to do, though, he doesn't think that's right. He thinks that she deserves to get something for basically having someone come in and break up a relationship that she was having. And so he wants to negotiate her to leave the son and take a fairly sizable sum of money from Jeters. This is, though bizarre relationship wheeling dealing, it is him showing that he is looking out for this woman's best interest, which is a very chivalric, knightly thing to do. Another thing we see of the chivalry is that he doesn't like to kill people. He says that very clearly in the story. He doesn't like violence. He sees it everywhere, right? In the story, bodies practically follow him around. Everywhere he goes, almost, you see another body. First, the other private detective in his office, then the brother of White Nose, right, gets gunned down right in front of Marlowe by the limo driver. And then finally, he finds the body of Jeter's son. He sees bodies everywhere. He's somewhat desensitized to it, but he also never forgets the horror of it because he holds life to be sacred. He doesn't like killing people, and he immediately dislikes the driver because of how quick he is to just kill this guy. Also, note that he is always collecting guns, but he never actually fires a shot in this whole story. He will sometimes use guns as a threat, but it's very rare in this or any Marlowe story for him to actually resort to violence. There is violence all around him, but Marlowe figures out ways to fight that don't involve him actually firing shots and getting violent with people. Marlowe doesn't like violence. He would much rather solve problems in other ways. Although he's good at fighting and he knows how to use a gun, he would prefer not to. This is one of the things that makes him most chivalric, most knightly, is his capability for violence, but his refusal to want to use violence as a means to solve his problems. And so thus we have Marlowe as the private detective knight in the story. We also see Harriet Huntress as an example of the femme fatale character. She is meeting, at first, it looks like, a lot of those characteristics. She's using her femininity as a weapon, right, to control Jeter's son, and also to get her revenge on Jeters himself, right, for what she did to her, for what he did, rather, to her father. She's also extremely intelligent. You'll note, Marlowe is very, very good at talking. He always talks himself out of whatever situations he can. He's good at talking. He's good at using language. Only one character in this whole story can match him in verbal sparring, to go back to back with quips and still be able to outdo each other. And that is Harriet Huntress. She is the only one in this whole story who is an equal to him when it comes to their ability to use language. She's also his equal in knowledge of firearms, right? Even though she plays dumb about guns, we see at the end that she is very capable of shooting, especially when the butler comes in and she just casually, Chandler tells us, shoots him right in the shoulder to get him to shut up and leave. That is a very precise shot that she took from a very small gun. She knows really well how to shoot to kill and also how to shoot to injure. So that is another thing that we wouldn't expect from a woman in this time period, but she defies those characteristics. She is a dangerous woman. At the same time, though, she's not like most femme fatales, because most femme fatales are 100% self-absorbed. They are only interested in their own ends. They only look out for themselves. They use people, specifically men, and then they disregard, they shove them away, throw them away, shoot them in some cases, get rid of them so that they can move on with whatever it is they wanted from them. Harriet Huntress is setting herself out to be like that by using the son to get revenge on the father. However, she changes her mind in the course of the story. She decides that she doesn't want to do this. She doesn't want to use herself, use her body, use her feminine wiles as a way to get revenge. She doesn't want to be in a relationship with this son just to get back at the father. And she breaks it off, and then she goes to old man Jeters to explain to him what she was doing and why she ultimately decided not to do her original plan. This shows that she is, in fact, under that dangerous exterior, she is a good person. She doesn't want to be a femme fatale, even though she has all the ability to do so. That makes her very unique in Pulp Fiction. The closest character I can think of to compare her is Catwoman. How Catwoman is ostensibly a villain, but in the end, if someone is actually in trouble, she will help them because her conscience won't let her not. That's who she is, even though she is also a thief and a lot of other things. Very similar thing with Harriet Huntress here. And this defying of expectations is something Chandler does a lot. He sets up archetypes of the detective fiction, but then he usually puts some kind of slant on them that you don't discover until the end of the story, and it makes you see that character in a whole new light. This is also something you see with the plot of the story is, in general, very complicated. I don't know about you all, but when I read this story, I did not know what on earth was going on until Marlowe revealed it all. Because it is very much one scene after another, after another, after another. Things keep happening, and many of them seem to have no connection whatsoever to the case at hand. Like when White Nose and his brother show up randomly in Marlowe's house and they threaten him and then they run. And who are they working for? Who knows? That's very common with Chandler. He makes these very complicated, very twisty plots that do not make sense until the end when he brings it all out. And sometimes in some of his more complicated stories, he doesn't even explain everything and he leaves you to try to piece together all the clues for yourself about some of the more minor details of the crime. The other very important thing about this story that is very common with Marlowe as a character is how he actually triumphs in this story. He is a very different detective from some of the more classic detectives like Sherlock Holmes, for instance, or Father Brown. He's intelligent, he's very smart, and he pieces things together as well as any other private detective. But the reason that Marlowe ultimately is able to triumph over his enemies in all of these stories is, weirdly enough, because he is willing to get beat up. The amount of times that Philip Marlowe gets beat up in any story is usually more than 2 times. And you see that in this story. He is constantly getting beat up, right? He is constantly putting himself in situations that end with some big palooka beating his face in, right? Or knocking him over and knocking him out, or something or other, right? Starting with when he goes to Harriet Huntress's apartment and her BF comes and knocks his lights out, right? And then he gets held hostage in his own home, and then, right? But the interesting thing is, by the end of the story, what you realize is that whenever Marlowe is getting beat up is when he is actually winning. The moment when Marlowe is beat up is the moment he's gaining the upper hand. And we see this all through here, right? When he's getting beat up by the son, the young Jeters, that allowed him in the aftermath to go downstairs and see the true colors of that house detective, that house detective didn't care that he was getting himself, that he had gotten beat up, and knew at that point that the house detective was corrupt. When he's getting held hostage by White Nose, and even Marlowe tells us he's getting freaked out as he's screwing the silencer on his gun, getting ready to shoot him dead. In that moment, he gets the final bits of information from White Nose that he needs to put the pieces together of who was the one behind all of this and who was the one who really killed Jeter's son, that it was Jeter's himself out to get the inheritance money. He also walks right into the villain's stronghold, Jeter's own mansion, right up to him with the psychotic limo driver and his gun, and Harriet Huntress and her gun, and he walks right into that situation that looks like certain death for him, and yet he's the one who's really in control of the situation because he knows who did what, and he also knows who Harriet really is, and that she will be backing him up with that little pistol of his once he reveals that Jeter's killed his own son and that the driver was the one who did all of his dirty work. So in each episode where Marlowe is getting beat up, he's gaining something throughout the case. It's when Marlowe looks like a loser, when it looks like he's down and out, when he's getting his face beaten in, that's actually when he's winning. When he looks his weakest, Marlowe is actually at his strongest. And that is truly unique in detective fiction. There was not before this a storyline where the detective's whole plan for solving the case revolved highly around getting beaten up, threatened with death, and all kinds of happening to him. But Marlowe realizes the benefits of being able to take a beating, because when those enemies think that they've got the upper hand, they get stupid and they get overconfident and they let things slip. And thus, he is always the one in control, even when it looks like he's not. And even when he knows if this just goes a little bit south, it's curtains for him, he's still the one in control. And so that's what we see in the story, that Marlowe is, though he is taking on this job that he didn't really want to take on, though he is working for a guy that he really doesn't like and that he suspects from the beginning is a bad dude, Marlowe tries his best to turn it around for the good of the lady, for the good of Harriet Huntress, which I think he knows from the moment he sees her, that she is not too far gone into this femme fatale, that though she's on her way, she's not too far gone, and she could be stopped. And probably why he starts to date her after the case is over, right? She's an equal with him, and he recognizes that she is also a good person deep down, that she hasn't been corrupted yet, like all these other characters have been. Jeter's above all. He's corrupted by greed, by money, by the love of money specifically. And you see that his son was corrupted by lust. And the cops are corrupted by incompetence, arrogance. That's why they need somebody like Marlowe in this world, somebody who cares not about the money, not about just doing his job, but about the people that he's around. That's why in the end he brings justice against his own employer. His employer was the murderer in the end. And he brings him to justice, and poor Marlowe never gets paid. Never gets paid. He really needed some money, but he never gets paid for this case. But he doesn't care. Why? Because Marlowe cares about justice. He wants justice to be done. That's why he's a detective, not for the money, but for justice. And that's what makes him a hero in these stories. And also what makes, I think, people like Harriet Huntress respect him enough to date him at the end. And yet, even when Marlowe wins, he still doesn't get much from it, because ultimately she runs off and doesn't even say goodbye, right? Just like he never got paid. Though Marlowe solves the cases, though he triumphs, Marlowe often does not get paid and often does not end up with the girl or anything to show for it. Why? Because this is now the bittersweet theme of Raymond Chandler, that for a medieval knight living in corrupt contemporary America, life is not going to be great for him. In the Middle Ages, his chivalry would have been rewarded. He would have been promoted. He would have been given lands and wealth and had a great lady probably fall in love with him and marry him. Marlowe, all he gets is to go back to his apartment without a paycheck. Why? Because the world that Chandler lived in, and to some extent the world even we still live in today, is not a world that tolerates people who are just, people who care about other people, people who want justice. It's so corrupt by people like cheaters, like people who are just out for themselves, like the mob boss and the cops. There's so very few people like Marlowe because being Marlowe comes at a great cost in this world. Not only will you not be promoted, you will actually wind up without a paycheck. If Marlowe had just done what was in the best interest of his employers and sold out on his ethics, he would have been a much better, less hungry detective, right? But he won't. Why? Because he's a good man and because he's in this for justice. He pays the price. But he also winds up not dead or in jail or any of those things. And thus, he's able to go out and to help somebody else out at his own expense. And he'll keep doing this until he dies because that's who he is. That's the only person he can be. And there's something beautiful and there's something tragic about that. Well, that is about all I have to say on this subject. I hope that you all stay out of trouble. Don't go to no gambling parlors or speakeasies, and make sure that if you're ever in trouble, you call up a PI who will care about you as much as Philip Marlowe. Good night, ladies and gentlemen, and God bless.